hi everyone, I'm Simon and I'm going to talk about education engagement for teenagers with cancer. I'm not going to move around as much as Bob, so if you can get used to sort of seeing me standing generally here, get yourself comfortable, that'll be great. So start off with describing who I am, which is always a good place to start. I was the learning mentor on the Teenage Cancer Board for 5 years, between 2004 and 2009. And in that role, I provided education support to teenagers and young adults between 13 and 24 years old. And while I was doing that role, I sort of had to develop it individually. There wasn't a template to work towards, so I had to sort of design the role and fit it in with whatever the individual patients needed from me. And in that way, I was kind of tailoring it to what their individual needs were and sort of experiencing and finding out what different needs teenagers had. And I really got a feel for how education was really an issue that crossed a lot of different areas for different people and wasn't as simple as just doing schoolwork. So I left the service in 2009 and started a PhD, looking at this in more detail. I wanted to know more about the ins and outs of education and how that worked for young people. So I started in 2009, handing it in next month, which is very soon. And also alongside that, I've been a teenage and young adult researcher, looking at various different psychosocial and medical projects, linking different centres around Europe. So I'm mainly going to talk about the PhD work today. My PhD has moved through 3 different main stages, looking at the research literature, so looking at what other people have done and what that has shown. Looking at 2 questionnaire studies, one with young people and one with professionals who work in this area. And a longer-term interview study where I've been really talking to young people in more depth about what education means to them and what helps them carry on with their education. So we're going to move through these different stages. So what did the literature say? The first thing that I found was there wasn't very much. So there's not very much research at all done in the area of teenage and young adult education engagement. Anything that does look at how young people after a diagnosis of cancer, how their engagement in education affects them, all seems to be with survivors of childhood cancer. There's not very much on teenage cancer. And there is quite a lot of teenage cancer research, but some of that refers to education, but only as a small subsection of bigger studies. So these research projects that have looked at education a bit have shown that young people tend to worry about education as one of their main worries as soon as they're diagnosed. And a lot of young people, despite all of the medical and health implications of their diagnosis, still worry a lot about education. Friends were, as you would imagine, an important part of young people's school lives. This is only really sort of hinted at in the literature and not looked at in very much detail. In a very general sense, the literature showed that it's important to work together. So healthcare professionals, education professionals, the young people themselves and parents, important that everybody works together to make sure that education can progress for young people. Which sounds straightforward, but actually when that's not happening, that can be a real barrier to this being successful. But having looked at all of the literature, it was still unclear whether maintaining engagement with education actually made a difference to young people, and whether the fact that they went to school and they still carried on with the schoolwork, whether that had long-term implications. Some studies showed that a lot of time away from school led to worse education outcomes for young people. Some studies showed that it made no difference at all. The time they missed from school didn't make any difference. And I found one study that showed that actually young people who are diagnosed with cancer go on to achieve higher than average levels of education and vocation, but it takes them a little bit longer to fill the gaps that they had. So very inconsistent message in the literature. So I want to look at this in more detail. So 2 questionnaire studies, one with professionals, where I asked professionals to tell me about their experience of observing young people trying to maintain their school life and education. I had 40 respondents from around the UK. So what did they say? I asked them what was helpful, what they'd seen as helpful factors in maintaining education. They said, like the literature, that effective liaison between the main 3 different environments they were in was a very important factor. So hospital, school and home, all talking to each other to make this work was very important. They also realised that the involvement of family and friends was important, but the key word there I think is informed. So they said that as long as friends and family members were aware of what the young person could and couldn't do and what their wishes were in that area, that they could be a very useful factor. And the flexibility of school staff and the education system in general was seen as very important. Education system can be very, very structured for young people with very fixed timetables and things to move through. And actually for the young people after they've been diagnosed with cancer, it seemed there needed to be a lot more flexibility from the system and also individual members of staff. And when that was there, that was a very helpful thing. I also asked them about the barriers. Unrealistic expectations was one of the key things that came through. They said that when school in particular had unrealistic expectations of what young people were and weren't able to do, that could be a real barrier. And I found when I was doing the learning mentor role that a lot of schools, when the young person was diagnosed, would say, "We're really sorry to hear about this. You go away and get yourself better and we'll be here for you when you come back." And thought that was a helpful message. And in some cases it was, and it came from a good place, but actually it sort of ignores the fact that the young people themselves want to carry on with their education, and there needs to be some sort of flexibility there and some realistic understanding of what people are capable of. Obviously the side effects of treatment and hospitalisation was a big barrier to maintaining engagement with education, and the practicalities of actually accessing education when you're moving so regularly between hospital and home and school was a difficulty. So what did the young people say? A survey of over 200 young people at the Find Your Sense of Tumour conference in 2010, which some of you may have heard of, was a conference that's aimed specifically at young people with cancer. So I asked them about lots of different aspects of their education. One seemingly quite basic finding was that two-thirds of the young people said they thought that education was very important. It seems like a basic finding, but when you think about the expectations that school staff sometimes have, and it's important to know that two-thirds of these people really do want to carry on with their education in amongst all of the other things that happen. I asked them where the main source of support came from within education, and when the young people said that their own school was the main source of support rather than a hospital school or rather than parents, they also were more likely to say that they'd maintained their friendship groups better. So it seems like maintaining contact with school regularly would help them maintain their friendships. And that was important because when they said that they maintained their friendships well, they also said they had more positive experience of reintegrating into school, and effects on their body image, changes in appearance, they didn't feel those as strongly as those people that didn't have school as a main source of support. So that was an interesting kind of little circle there of school supporting them to maintain their friends and friends supporting them getting back into school. So that was interesting. So these were all just sort of tick box questionnaires really. So I wanted to look at more detail of how the experiences were for young people. So I conducted an interview study where I had 12 participants and I followed them for the first year of their diagnosis. So I interviewed them close to their diagnosis, after 6 months and after 9 months. And I asked them to take photos in the 2 weeks leading up to the interview to capture anything they thought was important to their education or anything that had stopped them engaging in their education. And these are a couple of pictures that they took. And it was to try and get away from the idea of an interview being I'd sit down as a researcher with a list of questions and ask them and they'd answer them. This kind of gave them some more control over what they talked about, which I was hoping would let them sort of be more free to discuss the things that were important to them. So I'm going to run through some of the findings now. So the majority of participants I had spent significant periods of time away from school. In some cases, they didn't even attend school once in the year that I knew them. So they had 3 main options for carrying on with their education, which was to get involved with the hospital school, to have home tuition, or to learn independently themselves at home or in hospital with support from their school. And in reality, they tended to do a combination of all 3 of these things. I really hope you can read some of these quotes. Please move forward if you can't. But when I asked them about home tuition, some young people said that it was great, and one-to-one work really allowed them to get good access to quick feedback, and in some cases they felt that they'd actually got ahead of some of their peers through home tuition. Other young people, like this young girl, said that it was very strange for them to have a stranger come into their house and work so intently one-to-one with them in their home, and in some cases, like the quote says here, that this person had become more focused on how strange that dynamic was rather than actually the education work they should have been doing, and that's something that did come up quite regularly. Other young people, like this young man here, said that they missed out on some of the more fluid parts of education from not being in their classes. So the idea that a teacher would say something and then explain it in 2 or 3 different ways, or they might make their own notes about it. Those things were absent, and were not always able to do those things when they were working independently. And that was difficult for people when they were preparing for exams and trying to keep up with what their friends were doing in class. So exams were an interesting thing when I was talking to young people about them, because a lot of young people were doing GCSEs or preparing for GCSEs exams, and in every single situation the school had said to them, you don't need to sit your exams, we don't expect you to, if you want to that's fine, but you don't have to. And sixth form colleges that they were planning on going to had said, you don't need to get these grades to be able to come into our sixth form, we'll accept you whatever happens. But despite that, every single participant I had was desperate to sit their exams, really, really wanted to, despite all the external pressure being removed. And that kind of made me realise that these exams and the results that they get have some sort of inherent personal feel to the young people, and it kind of helps them to decide what they're worth, and they sort of used to getting that label of a grade, and it makes them feel like they're doing well, doing badly. I put this quote up, and I hope you can read this. It's from a young person who was a bone tumour patient who had a lot of intense chemotherapy, a lot of intense surgical interventions. And he was really engaged in the interviews. He was happy to tell me all about these intense experiences. But this was from his last interview where he was telling me about his exam results. And as you can see from the top line there, he actually got very good GCSE results by anybody's standards, really. But this was the only time that he became really upset during the interviews, and even though he talked about some of these intense physical things that he'd been through, this was the thing that seemed to get to him the most, the fact that he felt like he hadn't been able to achieve the level that he had, and despite the fact that the context of his experience would say, well, that's completely understandable, to him, he still felt that as that he'd let himself down and wasn't able to do the things that he wanted to, and it seemed to be a marker of how his cancer had affected his ability to be the same person that he was before. So that was quite a sort of interesting example of it. I was amazed how often young people said that they missed the routine of school, not something I was expecting to hear at all. And actually, school provides such a kind of unquestioned structure to people's lives that when they were out of school, they suddenly realised how important that routine was to them. And it seemed that quite a few of them found that the getting up and going to school every day gave them a sort of purpose to their daily routines and a framework that they could live their lives in. And actually, when they weren't doing that, like this young person said, she'd had a big period of time away from that, and then when she went back to it, she realised that actually it really helped her motivate herself to get up and be positively engaged in something. And this came up in a lot of the participants, and I was quite surprised. You wouldn't think they'd miss getting up in the morning, but they did seem to do that. But there was also a sense of belonging to school, and school being an environment where they felt wanted and they felt cared about. And this came up in lots of different variations. But the young person here, the young leukemia patient here, was talking about the fact that her school hadn't really been in touch with her to find out what was going on, and as you can see from the last line there, she wasn't really interested in them doing this anymore, because when she was first diagnosed, they hadn't really been in touch with her, and they hadn't really sort of shown that sort of feeling that they cared for her and that they wanted her to be part of that community. And this was something that was mentioned quite a few times, and in amongst all the practicalities of education, I think that feeling of still being wanted and still being cared for by the school environment was something that was very important to young people. So as you'd imagine, as the literature said, as the questionnaire said, friends were a big deal, and pretty much when I asked everyone the question, what are you looking forward to about going back to school, seeing friends was the first thing that came out almost every time. But it was a complicated area for these young people, and their dynamics within their friendship groups had often changed for different reasons, because they had this time away from school. So there's a recognition that some of their close friends they were still able to keep in touch with, but actually the wider group of peers they maybe only saw through school, keep in contact through social media, but most people said that wasn't really the same. It was okay, but it wasn't the same as seeing them face to face. And I thought this was quite interesting, summed up some of how the dynamics could change. This young person was talking about how he liked to interact with his friends and how they would kind of like to do lots of normal things and lots of normal kind of teenage things. But actually, he recognised that his friends were sort of scared to ask him about some of the things that had happened in hospital. But actually, he was okay if they had have asked him, he'd have been happy to talk about it. So they ended up with a dynamic where it felt like everyone wanted to talk about it and nobody really knew how to start that. And that was difficult socially, but also even more difficult in school, where all of your peers are suddenly there in one place. So I think there's some help that they need to be able to sort of talk about cancer with their friends, especially at school. And also there was a recognition that the experiences they'd had as cancer patients had sort of accelerated their maturity in some ways and given them a different perspective on what was important in life. And I had to put this quote up because I just is lovely, there's bigger things to worry about than Nando's, which sort of seemed to sum up how this changes for young people. And this young person has been through all her treatment for lymphoma and all the different things that involves, went back into her peer group, and they were squabbling over normal teenage things, which is completely appropriate, but she now had a different perspective on that. And although that's kind of a fun example, a lot of people did worry about that, and some of them found it difficult to reintegrate into their peers because of that shift in experience. And you know, their peer group haven't had those same experiences, and it's not something they would want to have, but it does change that dynamic. So some of this was linked in with the idea of telling people about their cancer experiences. So all of the participants had big chunks of time away from school, so they were aware that when they went back into school, they had this information about what had happened to them that other people wanted to know. But they quite often it didn't seem like they had the skills to know how to deal with that, who to tell, who had the right to know, and how to go about doing that. So this young person said, like a lot of people said, that actually it's good that other people know what's happening so that they can then better understand why they've got no hair, why they can't go into school as much, why they might be slower getting around school, so that kind of stopped any misconceptions about what they were able to do. So that was seen as an important thing for them, even though quite often they didn't really want a big deal made, but they did want other people to know what happened to them. But there was also a kind of feeling from young people that their lives had suddenly become public property within school, and a lot of participants weren't the centre of attention in school before they were diagnosed with cancer, and actually now they went back in, and they felt like wider circles of peers suddenly felt like they had the sort of right to come up and talk to them and ask them a lot of questions, and they quite often expressed a sort of barrage of questions when they went back into school that could be quite overwhelming for them. And like this person said here, she was surprised and actually seemed quite angry that people who didn't normally talk to her were crying about the things that had happened to her and felt like they could come up to her and ask her lots of personal questions about this really difficult thing. Managing that for young people was really complicated and something I didn't really feel they didn't seem to be very well prepared for. And it has to be said that in Leeds, a lot of the liaison nurse team will go out and do talks to school, and that was mentioned as something that was really helpful with this, but it's not something that is present everywhere, and it's not something that's necessarily done for everybody, so it's a difficult area for young people. Miscommunication with school was a big problem, and something that almost every participant had at least one example of. Tended to be things like generic letters that would go out when they hadn't attended a certain amount of lessons, which would be sent out to every single pupil. But in the case of the young people with cancer, it was obvious while they were away from school, and to get letters, saying that they've been absent for too long or they've missed certain exams was really quite upsetting for some young people. And there were other examples where young people got GCSE results, but they'd got the GCSE results before they'd been adjusted for special consideration, and so they opened these GCSE results and they were a lot lower than they were expecting, and actually it's something that could have been quite easily dealt with. But I think this was probably the best example. This is a massive quote, so I'm sorry if you can't read it, but I'll try and summarise it. So this young person, she'd been away from school for an entire year with a bone tumour, and she got an end of year report, and she talked about this at great length in her interview and regularly used the word hurt to describe how she felt about this. And it was nothing too blatantly bad, but it was the fact that every single teacher had put just blankly, this person has not been able to attend lessons, or this person is now aiming for a lower grade than they were before, or some teachers just left the box blank instead of making a comment. And she says here, quite rightly, that none of them had put, I hope you're getting better, or messages of kind of support, and that goes back to that feeling of community that young people missed out on. And this was really, really upsetting for her, and something that actually, again, in amongst all those other big experiences of treatment, this was something that was really quite difficult for her to accept. And also in the context of the rest of her experiences, her school, again, had not really been in touch to find out how things had been going on for her, so that in combination with this report was quite difficult, and something that I feel like could have been quite easily avoided if there had been somebody to just look at all the information that was going out to that person. They'd have seen that this wasn't really appropriate. So I think underpinning a lot of these, a lot of the things that I've talked about is the sort of difference between wanting to be treated normally, as a normal young person, as a normal student in school, and wanting to be treated with some sort of special consideration because they're a young person with cancer. And a lot of what you hear when you talk to people who work with young people with cancer is they want to be treated normally, they want to have normality. But actually, with school, it didn't seem quite as straightforward as that, and to go in and be treated exactly the same as all the other students wasn't always appropriate for them. And with the young people, it seemed that there was a fluctuation within their interviews about sometimes they wanted to be treated with a lot of special consideration, sometimes they wanted to be treated very normally. And this could change sometimes throughout the day, which made it very difficult for them to know what they wanted, and the people trying to support them to know how best to treat them. Do you treat them normally, therefore with the same rules as everyone else, or do you treat them differently? Yeah, so this person quite clearly says that he doesn't want to be treated differently. He wants to be treated as the same young person he's always been, not for the kind of illness he's got or for the kind of young person with cancer identity, that he doesn't want any part of that. But then at different points of his interview, he was very upset when teaching staff didn't take into account the fact that he was a young person with cancer. And there were several examples there where within a couple of lines of his interview, he was saying 2 or 3 different sort of slightly contradictory things, and that's not to criticise him at all, that's just going back to uncertainty that Bob was talking about. It's complicated, it's not always easy to know exactly how you want to be treated. Yeah, and this person had finished their treatment and had moved on into sixth form. So she finished her treatment several months before this, moved on into sixth form, and she often talked about having a new start, wanting to be a new person, having a fresh start. It was all very, very positive. And then after the first term of college, they did some evaluations about how well people were doing. And she was treated like all of the other students, and she wasn't achieving quite as well as they would have liked in some subjects. So they had a big talk about this and how maybe she shouldn't be in college, or maybe shouldn't be doing the subjects that she was doing, which did all seem a little bit harsh. But even several months after her treatment finished, she still needed some special consideration as a young person that had this gap in their education because of their hospital experiences. And very difficult balance, even into survivorship. I think this quote sums it up quite nicely. So this person says, talking about her friends and how she wants her friends to treat her, that she wanted them to be not exactly the same with her, wanted them to sort of be responsible, because normally they're quite crazy. So like not feel sorry for me or anything, but to be more thoughtful, but to still be their normal selves, which is kind of how, I don't know how her friends are supposed to know how she wants to be treated when that's the kind of mixed messages that she's giving. And it's not inappropriate, it's completely understandable based on what this person had been through, but it does make for a different dynamic. So, overall, what has the interviews shown? I think it's shown mainly that education cannot always be separated from other experiences. And I gave these young people opportunities to say anything they wanted to about education. So this talk could have all been about grades, it could have all been about attending school, it could have all been about classrooms and teachers, and it really was hardly about that at all. That was almost like a small section. And all of these other experiences were really what young people were going through when they were trying to maintain their education. And I think that's important because I don't know if that's always how education support services are set up. I think they're generally looking at helping people to fit back into that very structured education system. I don't know if that's always really what young people need the support with. So yeah, it's not always as easy as attending school, doing schoolwork, or sitting exams. And this desire for normality is variable, and I think that's important because I think there's often the message that you just want to treat young people as normal and that's what they want, and I do think that is slightly more complicated. And again, to avoid things like the miscommunication and to help facilitate this whole thing, everybody needs to communicate effectively, and I think that that's a basic finding but still fundamentally important, that schools need help with knowing how to treat young people need help to know how to fit back into their friendship groups, parents need to help by knowing where their responsibilities are and where they can help the school to help the young person better, and there's a whole range of communication options that need to be explored. I just want to thank all the participants that took part in my study and all the TYA professionals that have helped me to find rooms and to generally make all of this interview process happen. And thank the Multi Fund and the University of Leeds for funding the research.